In a busy city called New Haven, there lived a young man who was known for his quiet nature and sharp mind. He wasn't the kind of person you'd notice in a crowd, but if you did, it was usually because he had his nose buried in a book or was walking briskly with headphones on. This guy wasn't just any college student. He was someone special, though most people didn't know it. He spent his days studying mechanical engineering at one of the best universities in the area. It wasn't easy juggling classes, assignments, and part-time work to pay his bills, but he managed it all with determination. What many didn't realize was that this calm, focused young man carried a story far deeper than anyone could guess. Before stepping foot into college life, he had served 4 years in the U.S. Marine Corps. Those years weren't just about discipline and service. They shaped him into someone strong, not just physically but mentally too. While in the Marines, he picked up something else: Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. Through hard work and dedication, he earned a black belt in the martial art. But none of this ever came up in casual conversations. To everyone around him, he was simply the quiet guy who seemed more interested in equations than anything else. One chilly evening, as autumn leaves swirled around the streets, he decided to call it a night after hours of hitting the books at the library. The air was crisp and the streets were quieter than usual. As he walked toward his apartment, lost in thought about an upcoming midterm exam, he noticed a group of bikers hanging out near a small corner store. They were loud, laughing, and revving their motorcycles, making enough noise to echo through the empty streets. At first, he didn't think much of them. People like that were common in certain parts of town, and he figured they were just blowing off steam. But then, one voice cut through the hum of engines. "Hey, check out this dude," one of the bikers said, pointing directly at him. "What's your deal, huh? Too good to say hello?" The young man slowed down slightly, hoping they wouldn't bother him further. After all, he wasn't looking for trouble. All he wanted was to get home, maybe grab a quick snack and rest before another long day ahead. But fate had other plans. Instead of letting him pass unnoticed, the bikers started following him. Their motorcycles roared louder now, almost like a pack of wolves circling their prey. As they closed in, he felt his pulse quicken. His instincts told him to stay calm, but his mind raced. He knew better than to panic. It was one of the first lessons drilled into him during his time in the Marines. Stay alert, assess the situation, look for exits, keep your wits about you. These thoughts ran through his head in seconds, grounding him even as the tension grew thicker. One of the bikers, clearly the leader of the group, stepped forward. He was tall, muscular, and wore a leather jacket covered in patches that hinted at some sort of gang affiliation. There was no mistaking the challenge in his eyes as he cracked his knuckles and smirked. "You hear us talking to you?" the biker growled, taking a step closer. "We don't take kindly to being ignored." Though his heart pounded, the young man kept his cool. He stopped walking and turned to face them, raising his hands slightly to show he wasn't carrying anything dangerous. His voice was steady when he spoke. "I'm not trying to cause any problems," he said. "Just let me go on my way." But the bikers weren't satisfied. Another member chimed in, throwing insults and racial slurs his way. The leader laughed along, egging the others on. Then, without warning, he shoved the young man hard enough to make him stumble backward. This is where things got interesting. Inside, the young man felt anger bubbling up. Years ago, he might have reacted differently. But thanks to his training, both in the Marines and in Jiu Jitsu, he knew how to control his emotions. He reminded himself of what mattered most: staying composed under pressure and avoiding unnecessary conflict. Still, he couldn't help but wonder how far these bikers were willing to push things, and whether they truly understood who they were messing with. With each passing second, the standoff grew tenser. The bikers formed a loose circle around him, cutting off easy escape routes. Their laughter and taunts filled the air, but the young man remained silent, his focus razor-sharp. Little did they know, they were playing a dangerous game, one they were completely unprepared for. The situation was heating up fast. The young man stood still, his mind racing as the bikers closed in tighter. Their motorcycles were parked haphazardly around him, forming a loose circle that blocked any clear path to escape. The leader of the group stepped even closer, his boots crunching against the pavement. He had a cocky grin on his face like this was all some kind of game to him. "You think you're too smart for us?" The biker sneered, tilting his head to the side. "You think you can just walk by without saying a word?" The young man didn't respond right away. His eyes darted between the leader and the other bikers, calculating every move they made. He knew better than to let emotions take over. Years of training, both in the military and in martial arts, had taught him how to stay calm under pressure. But staying calm didn't mean he was going to back down. "I already told you," he said slowly, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "I'm not looking for trouble. Just let me go." But the bikers weren't interested in letting him go. One of them laughed loudly, shaking his head. "Oh, come on, tough guy," he called out. "You ain't fooling nobody. What's wrong, scared?" Another biker chimed in, tossing insults his way. The words stung, but not because they hurt his feelings. It was the sheer ignorance behind them, the assumption that they could say whatever they wanted, do whatever they wanted, without facing consequences. The young man clenched his fists briefly, then forced himself to relax. Losing control now would only make things worse. The leader must have sensed his hesitation because he took another step forward, closing the gap between them. Then, without warning, he swung his fist, a wild, reckless punch aimed straight at the young man's face. Years of combat training kicked in instantly. The young man ducked low, avoiding the blow with ease. Before the leader could recover, he shifted his weight and moved slightly to the side, putting distance between himself and the biker. The missed punch threw the leader off balance, and for a moment, surprise flickered across his face. "Whoa, whoa," one of the other bikers shouted, pointing and laughing. "Looks like our boy's got moves." The comment seemed to irritate the leader even more. He turned back to the young man, his expression darkening. "All right, funny guy," he growled. "Let's see what else you've got." Two more bikers joined in, stepping forward and spreading out to flank him from both sides. They thought they had the upper hand, 3 against 1. But they underestimated their opponent. The young man's mind was working faster than theirs. Every movement they made, every shift in their stance, registered in his brain like pieces of a puzzle, falling into place. One of the bikers lunged at him, swinging wildly. The young man sidestepped quickly, grabbing the attacker's arm mid-swing. With practiced precision, he twisted it just enough to force the biker to his knees. A sharp cry escaped the man's lips as he hit the ground, clutching his wrist in pain. Before anyone else could react, the young man spun around to face the second biker. This one hesitated for a split second, unsure whether to charge or retreat. That moment of doubt was all it took. The young man delivered a swift kick to the man's knee, sending him stumbling backward. The biker crashed onto the pavement, groaning, as he tried to get back up. The entire scene unfolded in mere seconds, but it felt like hours to everyone watching. The remaining bikers froze, stunned by what they'd just witnessed. None of them had expected this quiet, unassuming guy to fight back so effectively. Even the leader looked shaken, though he tried hard to hide it. The young man stood tall now, his breathing controlled and his posture unwavering. His eyes locked onto the leader's, daring him to make the next move. There was no fear in his gaze, only determination. "Back off," he warned, his voice firm and commanding. "You don't want to do this." For a moment, no one moved. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the ragged breathing of the fallen bikers. The leader stared at him, his jaw tightening. Then, to everyone's surprise, he chuckled. A low, uneasy laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You've got guts, kid," the leader admitted, scratching the back of his neck. "And skills. We didn't mean any harm, just having some fun." The young man didn't relax his guard. "Fun doesn't involve threatening someone because of their skin color." He shot back, his tone icy. "Choose your fun better next time." The leader held up his hands in surrender, signaling for his crew to stand down. Slowly, reluctantly, the bikers helped their injured members to their feet. They climbed back onto their motorcycles, revving the engines as if trying to regain some sense of dominance before speeding off into the night. As the sound of their bikes faded into the distance, the young man finally allowed himself to exhale. His heart was still pounding and his muscles were tense from the adrenaline rush. But he felt no satisfaction, only relief that the confrontation hadn't escalated further. Still, he couldn't shake the frustration bubbling inside him. Why did people feel the need to act like that? What gave them the right to judge others based on appearances? He glanced around the empty street, half expecting someone to come out of the shadows and ask what had happened. But there was no one. Just the cold wind sweeping through the deserted road. Shaking his head, he adjusted his backpack and started walking again, leaving the scene behind him. Though the danger had passed, the memory lingered. He knew incidents like this weren't uncommon, not for someone who looked like him. And while he'd managed to handle it tonight, he couldn't help but wonder how many others faced similar situations without the tools or confidence to defend themselves. As he continued toward his apartment, his thoughts drifted to the lessons he'd learned over the years. Discipline, patience, courage. These weren't just concepts taught in training. They were principles meant to guide everyday life. Tonight, those principles had saved him. But maybe, just maybe, they could also inspire others. By the time he reached his apartment, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving him drained but wide awake. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and leaned against it for a moment, letting the quiet of his small living space wash over him. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, a soothing rhythm compared to the chaos he'd just left behind. His mind replayed the events of the night. Each shove, each insult, each punch that never landed. It wasn't something he could easily shake off. He dropped his backpack onto the floor and walked over to the kitchen sink, splashing cold water on his face. The chill helped clear his thoughts, but it didn't erase the frustration simmering beneath the surface. For years, he'd dealt with moments like this. Not always as intense, but always rooted in the same ignorance. People saw what they wanted, to see someone who looked different, someone they thought was weaker or less deserving. They made assumptions without knowing anything about him. The sacrifices he'd made, the battles he'd fought, the life he'd built for himself. As he dried his face with a towel, he glanced at the reflection in the mirror. The person staring back at him looked tired but resolute. This wasn't the first time he'd stood up for himself, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But tonight felt different. Something about the way those bikers underestimated him stuck with him more than usual. Maybe it was their arrogance, or maybe it was the realization that no matter how far he went in life, some people would always try to tear him down. Either way, it gnawed at him. The next morning, he woke up early, as he always did. He skipped breakfast and headed straight to the gym, a habit he'd kept since his days in the Marines. Exercise wasn't just about staying fit. It was therapy. Punching the heavy bag let him channel his anger into something productive. Each strike echoed through the room, releasing pent-up tension. After an hour, he moved to the mats, practicing Jiu Jitsu techniques until sweat soaked through his shirt. By the time he finished, his body ached, but his mind felt lighter. When he got to campus later that day, things seemed normal at first. Students bustled between classes, chatting and laughing like any other weekday. But as he walked across the quad, he noticed something unusual. A group of students standing near the library were whispering and glancing in his direction. At first he assumed they were talking about someone else, but then one of them waved timidly, catching his attention. "Hey," the student said, approaching cautiously. "Are you, the guy from last night?" He stopped walking and frowned. "What are you talking about?" The student pulled out his phone and showed him a video. In it, he saw himself fending off the bikers. The quick movements, the takedowns, the calm demeanor, even as the situation escalated. Someone had filmed part of the confrontation and posted it online. Already, the clip had thousands of views and hundreds of comments. "I didn't know anyone recorded it," he muttered, handing the phone back. The student grinned nervously. "Yeah, it blew up overnight. Everyone's calling you a hero." A hero? He almost laughed at the idea. He hadn't been trying to save anyone. He'd just been defending himself. Still, there was no denying the impact the video was having. As he walked to class, more people stopped him to talk. Some thanked him for standing up to the bikers, while others asked if he was okay. One girl even handed him a note that read, "You inspire me." At first he tried to brush it off, insisting he hadn't done anything extraordinary. But the attention kept coming. By lunchtime, professors were mentioning it in lectures, praising his courage and composure. Even the university's social media page shared the video, tagging it with hashtags like "Our real-life hero" and "Stand against hate." It was overwhelming and not entirely comfortable. That afternoon, he decided to visit the campus coffee shop, hoping to find a quiet corner where he could regroup. Instead, he found himself surrounded by reporters. Local news outlets had caught wind of the story and were eager to interview him. Cameras flashed, microphones were shoved in his face, and questions flew at him from all directions. "What happened? Last night? How did you learn to fight like that? Do you think this will inspire others to stand up against bullies?" He held up his hands, signaling for them to stop. "I appreciate the interest," he said firmly, "but I'm not here to be famous. I just want to focus on my studies." His words didn't deter the reporters, though. They followed him as he tried to leave, snapping photos and shouting more questions. Frustrated, he ducked into a nearby building and waited until they gave up and left. When he finally emerged, he felt exhausted, not physically, but emotionally. He hadn't asked for any of this. All he'd wanted was to live his life peacefully. But as much as the attention bothered him, it also made him think. If people were inspired by what he'd done, maybe he could use that to make a difference. That evening, he sat at his desk, staring at the blinking cursor on his laptop screen. He opened a blank document and began typing. Thoughts poured out of him about racism, resilience, and the importance of standing up for yourself and others. He wrote about his experiences, both before and after joining the Marines, and how they'd shaped the person he was today. By the time he finished, it was late, but he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. The next day, he submitted the essay to the school newspaper. Within hours, it went viral. Readers praised his honesty and vulnerability, sharing their own stories of discrimination and empowerment in the comments section. Messages poured in from strangers thanking him for speaking out. One message stood out in particular. It came from a young high school student who wrote, "I've been bullied my whole life because of how I look. Watching your video and reading your story made me realize I don't have to let people treat me badly anymore. Thank you for showing me that strength isn't about fighting. It's about believing in yourself." Reading those words hit him hard. For the first time, he understood that his actions weren't just about self-defense. They were about sending a message that everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are or where they come from. And sometimes, standing up for yourself can give others the courage to do the same. Over the next few days, invitations started rolling in. Community organizations asked him to speak at events. Local gyms offered him free membership in exchange for teaching self-defense classes. Even a veteran support group reached out, inviting him to mentor young people transitioning out of the military. At first, he hesitated. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and the idea of public speaking terrified him. But deep down, he knew he couldn't turn away from the opportunity to help others. So, he accepted. He began teaching self-defense workshops at a nearby gym, focusing not just on physical techniques but also on mental toughness and conflict resolution. Many of his students were kids from underserved communities, eager to learn how to protect themselves. He encouraged them to channel their energy into positive outlets, reminding them that true strength comes from discipline and compassion. Through it all, he remained humble. He never claimed to be a hero or a role model. To him, he was just a regular person doing what needed to be done. But to everyone else, he was proof that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they refuse to back down. As weeks turned into months, the initial buzz died down, and life returned to some semblance of normalcy. Yet the ripple effects of that single night continued to spread. Conversations about racial inequality and personal empowerment gained momentum on campus and beyond. Students formed discussion groups, faculty hosted panels, and local leaders took steps to address issues of discrimination in the community. For him, The experience became a turning point. It reminded him why he worked so hard, to create opportunities, not just for himself but for others. And though he still preferred staying out of the limelight, he embraced the chance to make a difference, one step at a time. The days following the incident turned into weeks, and life began to settle into a new rhythm. The attention hadn't completely faded, but it had shifted from overwhelming chaos to something more manageable. He found himself stepping into roles he never imagined for himself: mentor, speaker, advocate. Each role came with its own challenges, but also rewards that made him feel like he was contributing to something bigger than himself. One chilly Saturday morning, he arrived at the gym where he'd started teaching self-defense classes. It wasn't a fancy place by any means, just an old warehouse converted into a training space, but it had character. The walls were painted a deep blue, and motivational posters hung crookedly on the peeling paint. The mats in the center of the room smelled faintly of sweat and determination. To him, it felt perfect. As he walked in, the chatter of students filled the air. They ranged in age from teenagers to adults in their 30s, all eager to learn. Some came because they wanted to defend themselves against bullies or threats. Others were there simply to build confidence. Whatever their reasons, they shared one thing in common: a desire to grow stronger, not just physically but mentally too. He greeted each student warmly as they filed in, shaking hands and exchanging small talk. "How's school going?" he asked a shy teenager who always sat quietly in the corner during breaks. "Still struggling with math?" The boy nodded sheepishly, but his face lit up when he mentioned his recent improvement in class. Moments like these reminded him why he kept coming back. Teaching wasn't just about showing people how to throw a punch or escape a hold. It was about connecting with them, understanding their struggles, and helping them believe in themselves. Once everyone was settled, he called the group to attention. "All right, let's get started," he said, clapping his hands together. "Today we're focusing on balance and control. Remember, it's not about overpowering your opponent, it's about using their energy against them." He demonstrated a basic technique, moving slowly so everyone could follow along. His movements were fluid, almost effortless, a testament to years of practice. As the students paired off to try the moves themselves, he moved around the room, offering guidance and encouragement. When someone struggled, he knelt beside them, breaking down the steps until they got it right. "You've got this," he told a young woman who hesitated before attempting a takedown. She glanced at him nervously, then took a deep breath and executed the move perfectly. Her face broke into a wide grin as her partner laughed good-naturedly. "See? I knew you could do it," he said, giving her a thumbs up. By the end of the session, the room buzzed with energy. Students lingered afterward, asking questions and sharing stories. One man, a father in his late 20s, approached him hesitantly. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot. "My kid gets picked on at school and I didn't know how to help him. Now I feel like I can teach him some of this stuff." He smiled, patting the man on the shoulder. "That's what it's all about. Protecting yourself is important, but protecting the people you care about, that's what really matters." Outside the gym, his influence continued to spread. A local community center invited him to speak at a panel discussion about racial inequality and resilience. At first, he hesitated. Public speaking wasn't his strong suit, and the topic hit close to home. But after some thought, he agreed. If sharing his story could spark meaningful conversations, he owed it to himself and to others to step up. The event was held in a packed auditorium, with rows of chairs filled with people of all ages and backgrounds. As he stood behind the podium adjusting the microphone, he felt a familiar wave of nerves wash over him. The spotlight was uncomfortable, and the weight of expectation pressed down on his shoulders. But as he looked out at the audience, he saw faces full of curiosity and hope. That gave him the push he needed to start. "I'm not here to tell you I have all the answers," he began, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "I'm just someone who's been through experiences that shaped who I am today, And if my story can help even one person see their own strength, then it's worth telling. He spoke openly about growing up in a world where assumptions were made based on skin color, about serving in the Marines and learning to push past fear, and about the night when a group of bikers tested his resolve. He didn't sugarcoat anything. He talked about the anger, the frustration, the moments of doubt. But he also emphasized the lessons he'd learned, the importance of staying calm under pressure, the value of discipline, and the power of believing in yourself. When he finished, the room erupted into applause. People lined up to ask questions or share their own stories. A middle-aged woman approached him afterward, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "My son is joining the military next year, and hearing you talk gives me hope that he'll come out stronger, not just as a soldier but as a person." Her words struck a chord deep within him. For so long he'd focused on his own journey, rarely considering how it might inspire others. Now he realized the impact he could have if he kept sharing his experiences. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about creating connections, fostering understanding, and empowering people to rise above adversity. Back at school, his professors noticed a change in him. He became more vocal in class discussions, challenging ideas and encouraging classmates to think critically about social issues. During a lecture on systemic racism, he raised his hand and shared insights from his own life, sparking a lively debate that lasted long after the bell rang. His peers respected him not just for his intelligence, but for his willingness to engage authentically. Word of his activism reached beyond campus, catching the attention of a veteran support organization. They invited him to join their mentorship program, which aimed to help young people transition out of the military and reintegrate into civilian life. At first, he doubted whether he had enough experience to contribute, but the organizers assured him that his unique perspective would be invaluable. He accepted the offer and quickly found himself mentoring a group of former service members. Many of them struggled with the same feelings of isolation and uncertainty that he'd faced after leaving the Marines. Together, they worked through challenges, celebrated victories, and built a sense of camaraderie that reminded him of his days in uniform. Seeing their progress filled him with pride. It was proof that growth was possible no matter how difficult the journey. Despite all the positive changes, he remained grounded. He still spent hours studying in the library, attended lectures faithfully, and juggled part-time work to make ends meet. Life wasn't easy, but it was fulfilling in ways he hadn't anticipated. Every day brought new opportunities to connect with people, to listen, and to lead by example. One evening, as he sat on the steps outside his apartment building, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, he reflected on how far he'd come. From the quiet, unassuming student who preferred blending into the background to someone who inspired others to stand tall, he had grown in ways he never imagined. Yet, he knew this was only the beginning. There was still so much work to be done, for himself, for his community, and for future generations. And though the path ahead wouldn't always be smooth, he felt ready to face whatever came his way. After all, he'd already proven to himself that true strength lies not in fists, but in character. As the weeks rolled on, the ripple effects of that one night continued to spread, touching lives in ways he couldn't have predicted. The self-defense classes at the gym grew so popular that the owner had to start a waiting list for new students. People from all walks of life, teenagers looking for confidence, parents wanting to protect their families, even retirees hoping to stay active, were signing up. Each session brought fresh faces and new stories, each one unique but connected by a shared desire to grow stronger. He noticed something special about these classes. They weren't just about learning techniques. They were becoming a community. After every lesson, students lingered, chatting and laughing like old friends. They shared advice, swapped tips, and encouraged one another. He often stayed late, listening as they opened up about their struggles, whether it was dealing with bullies, overcoming fear, or simply finding their place in the world. It reminded him how much people craved connection, especially when life felt heavy. One evening, after a particularly energetic class, A young woman approached him hesitantly. She looked no older than 18, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if trying to shield herself from the world. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" she asked softly, avoiding eye contact. "Of course," he replied, gesturing toward a quiet corner of the gym. Once they sat down, she took a deep breath before speaking. Her name was Mia, though he didn't know it yet, and she explained that she'd been bullied relentlessly throughout high school. The harassment had followed her online too, turning social media into a minefield of cruel comments and threats. She admitted she'd started skipping school, isolating herself, and doubting her worth. But tonight, she trailed off, glancing at the mats where others were still practicing. "Watching everyone here, seeing how strong they are, it made me realize I can be strong too, not just physically, but mentally." Her words struck a chord deep within him. He nodded slowly, remembering his own battles with doubt and fear. "You're already stronger than you think," he told her gently. "Strength isn't about never feeling afraid. It's about facing your fears anyway, and surrounding yourself with people who lift you up instead of tearing you down." Mia left that night with a small smile on her face, promising to return for the next class. Over time, she became a regular, gradually opening up more and gaining confidence. Watching her transformation filled him with pride, not because he'd done anything extraordinary, but because he'd given her the tools to believe in herself. Meanwhile, his efforts outside the gym gained traction as well. The veteran support organization he worked with invited him to speak at a regional conference aimed at helping service members transition back into civilian life. Standing in front of hundreds of attendees, he felt the familiar flutter of nerves in his stomach. But as he began to share his story, the room fell silent, hanging on to every word. "I won't lie to you," he said, pacing slowly across the stage. "Leaving the military wasn't easy. For years, my identity was tied to being a Marine. When that chapter ended, I felt lost. I didn't know who I was anymore or what I was supposed to do next." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Then he continued, "But I realized something important. We carry our experiences with us no matter where we go. Those lessons, the discipline, the resilience, the brotherhood, they don't disappear once you take off the uniform. They become part of who you are, and they can guide you through whatever comes next." The applause that followed was thunderous, but what moved him most were the conversations afterward. Veterans approached him, sharing their own struggles with transitioning back to civilian life. Some thanked him for putting their feelings into words. Others asked for advice on finding purpose outside the military. One man, a former Army medic, confessed that he'd been battling depression since leaving the service. Hearing someone else talk openly about similar challenges gave him hope that things could get better. These interactions reinforced a truth he'd come to understand deeply. Vulnerability is powerful. By sharing his own struggles, he created space for others to open up about theirs. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when he questioned whether he was doing enough or saying the right things, but the gratitude he saw in people's eyes kept him going. Back on campus, his influence continued to grow. A group of students launched an initiative called Stand Together, inspired by his message of unity and empowerment. They organized workshops, panel discussions, and outreach programs aimed at fostering inclusivity and combating discrimination. He attended their first event, sitting in the audience as students spoke passionately about creating a safer, kinder campus environment. Afterward, one of the organizers, a bubbly sophomore named Alex, pulled him aside. "We wouldn't have started this without you," Alex said earnestly. "Your story showed us that change is possible, that standing up for ourselves and each other matters." He smiled, humbled by the compliment. "It's not about me," he replied. "It's about all of you. You're the ones making the difference." Despite the growing recognition, he remained humble. Fame wasn't what drove him. It was the knowledge that his actions could inspire others to take control of their lives. Still, there were days when the pressure felt overwhelming. Balancing schoolwork, teaching, mentoring, and activism left little room for rest. Late nights became the norm as he pored over essays, planned lessons, and responded to messages from people seeking guidance. 1. Particularly exhausting evening, he found himself sitting alone in his apartment staring blankly at a textbook. His mind wandered back to the night with the bikers, to the chaos and tension that had unfolded so unexpectedly. Had he ever imagined then that it would lead to this? To standing in front of crowds, teaching classes and mentoring strangers? Knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Opening it, he found his neighbor, a retired teacher named Mrs. Thompson, standing there with a plate of cookies. "I heard you've been busy lately," she said with a warm smile. "Thought you might need a little pick-me-up." Her kindness caught him off guard. He thanked her and accepted the plate, inviting her in for a chat. As they talked, she shared stories from her own life, including the challenges she'd faced as a young educator determined to make a difference in underserved communities. Her words resonated with him, reminding him that everyone has a role to play in shaping a better future. "You remind me of myself when I was younger," Mrs. Thompson said as she prepared to leave. "Fierce, compassionate, and unafraid to stand up for what's right. Don't lose sight of that." Her parting words stayed with him long after she left. Fierce, compassionate, unafraid. Was that who he was now? Maybe. Or maybe he was still figuring it out. Either way, he knew one thing for certain. The journey wasn't about perfection. It was about progress. Over the next few months, he leaned into his roles with renewed energy. The self-defense classes expanded to include sessions focused on mental health and conflict resolution. The Veteran Mentorship Program launched a peer support network, connecting former service members across the region. And on campus, Stand Together blossomed into a thriving movement, drawing attention from local news outlets and inspiring similar initiatives at other schools. Through it all, he held on to the lessons he'd learned along the way. That true strength lies in lifting others up, that vulnerability creates connection, and that even the smallest actions can spark meaningful change. Life wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was rich with purpose, and for him that was enough. As the months passed, the young man began to notice subtle changes, not just in the world around him, but within himself. He wasn't the same person he'd been before that fateful night with the bikers. The quiet, reserved college student, who preferred to blend into the background, had transformed into someone unafraid to step into the spotlight when it mattered. But this newfound confidence didn't make him arrogant or distant. Instead, it deepened his connection with others. People saw him as a leader, not because he demanded attention, but because he led by example. One crisp morning, as autumn leaves swirled in the wind, he received an email that caught him off guard. It was from a local nonprofit organization dedicated to helping underprivileged youth. They were hosting their annual gala and wanted to honor him with an award for his contributions to the community. At first he thought it was a mistake. Him? An honoree? He almost laughed at the idea, but then he read the message again, noticing how they described his work. A beacon of hope, an inspiration to countless lives, a true champion of resilience. He stared at the screen for a long time, unsure of what to feel. Pride, humility, gratitude, maybe all three. In the end, he accepted the invitation, not because he craved recognition, but because he realized the platform could amplify his message even further. If sharing his story could inspire one more person to believe in themselves, it would be worth it. The gala was held in a grand ballroom adorned with twinkling lights and elegant decorations. Tables filled with guests dressed in suits and gowns lined the space while soft music played in the background. When his name was called to receive the award, he walked up to the stage amidst applause. His palms were sweaty and his heart raced, but he reminded himself why he was there, for the people whose lives he hoped to touch. Standing behind the podium, he looked out at the sea of faces watching him intently. For a moment, he felt overwhelmed. How could he possibly put everything he'd experienced into words? Then he remembered something Mrs. Thompson had told him weeks earlier. Speak from the heart. That's where your power lies. Taking a deep breath, he began. I never set out to be anyone's hero, he said, his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling inside him. I'm just someone who believes in standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. And I'm proof that you don't have to be extraordinary to make a difference. You just have to care enough to try. He went on to share snippets of his journey, the challenges he'd faced growing up, the lessons he'd learned in the Marines, and the moments that shaped his understanding of strength and courage. He spoke about the importance of community, of lifting each other up rather than tearing each other down. He emphasized that change starts small, with one act of kindness, one conversation, one decision to stand firm against injustice. When he finished, the room erupted into applause once again. This time, though, the noise felt different. It wasn't just polite clapping, it was genuine appreciation, a collective acknowledgement of the impact he'd made. As he returned to his seat, strangers approached him throughout the evening, thanking him for his words and sharing their own stories. One guest, a mother raising 2 sons in a rough neighborhood, hugged him tightly and whispered, "You're giving my boys hope." The recognition from the gala opened new doors. Local businesses offered sponsorships to expand his self-defense classes, allowing him to reach even more people. Schools invited him to speak at assemblies, where students listened eagerly to his advice on overcoming adversity. Even larger organizations reached out, asking him to collaborate on projects aimed at promoting diversity and inclusion. Despite the growing opportunities, he remained grounded. Fame wasn't his goal, and he refused to let it distract him from what truly mattered, helping others. He continued balancing schoolwork, teaching, and activism, though he admitted it wasn't always easy. There were days when exhaustion crept in, when the weight of expectations threatened to overwhelm him. On those days, he reminded himself of why he started, to create a better future not just for himself but for everyone. One chilly winter evening, as he prepared for another self-defense class, he reflected on how far he'd come. The gym smelled of polished wood and sweat, familiar scents that brought comfort. Students trickled in, chatting excitedly as they warmed up. Among them was Mia, the young woman who had once doubted her own strength. She now moved with confidence, effortlessly, demonstrating techniques to newcomers. Watching her teach, he felt a swell of pride. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. After class, Mia lingered behind, waiting until the others left before approaching him. "I wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You saved me, in a way. Not just physically, but emotionally. I used to think I'd never escape the pain of being bullied. Now I know I'm stronger than anything life throws at me." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, in the best possible way. He smiled softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You saved yourself, Mia. I just gave you the tools. Never forget how powerful you are." As the year drew to a close, he found himself sitting on the steps outside his apartment building, staring at the stars. The city lights dimmed their brilliance, but they shone nonetheless, stubborn and resilient. He thought about all the people he'd met along the way, the veterans finding their footing, the students discovering their voices, the strangers inspired to take action. Each one carried a piece of his story forward, creating ripples of change that extended far beyond what he could see. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth. Challenges would arise, doubts would creep in, and there would be moments when he questioned whether he was doing enough. But he also knew something else. He wasn't alone. The community he'd helped build supported him as much as he supported them. Together they formed a web of strength, compassion, and determination. That night, as he drifted off to sleep, he thought about the future, not just his own, but the future of the movement he'd sparked. He imagined a world where no one felt powerless, where everyone had access to the tools and resources they needed to thrive. It was a lofty dream, perhaps, but dreams often start with small steps. And so, the quiet scholar became a symbol of resilience, a living reminder that true strength isn't about fists or bravado. It's about character, compassion, and the unwavering belief that we all have the power to rise above adversity. For him, life wasn't about seeking glory, it was about living with purpose, integrity, and courage. And through every challenge, triumph, and moment of doubt, he proved that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they refuse to back down. The end.